Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series, Embracing Change. We've got Vanessa Wong, well, Dr. Vanessa Wong, sorry, with us today from Hong Kong. So same, in the same space as me in terms of time and energy. Thank you, Vanessa, for being with us today. For those of you who knew her father, Dr. Philip Wong, many of you have been cared for by him and was a dear friend and an incredible human being. So thank you, Vanessa, for continuing what you spoke to before we started, the legacy. So let's see how it all plays out. So of course, you have a very different background in the sense it's, you know, you're coming in from the mental health side and that perspective with an incredible background. So let's, if you don't mind, let's start very basic, right? Let's talk about the words that we hear a lot, right? Stress, trauma, meaning of life. Why don't you help us walk through what do these mean, you know, from your perspective, and maybe just what people have maybe misconceptions of it, right? So that way we can kind of create the definition and then build from there, if that's okay for you.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So I wanted to talk about stress today because, like you said, a lot of people use the word stress. So my job stresses me out. I'm stuck in traffic. It stresses me. And the narrative we use, the word something stresses me, we are in a position where something is done to us. And usually we feel a bit helpless about the situation. So then we feel that we don't have any control and therefore it feels stressful. However, the word that doesn't get used much is perceived stress. So how do I see the situation? Well, if I feel that I have more agency, I have more ability to manage it, I feel less overwhelmed by a situation. And a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of it as, well, I allow my boss to yell at me, or I allow myself to be stuck in traffic, because that narrative doesn't quite go with how we think about stress. But actually it's a two-way street, you know, how things happen and how we respond to it. And it's actually our reaction to an event that is what causes our body to feel the stress from a physiological and mental point of view. So I think that's the most important concept I think a lot of people don't know or understand, is that it's not just things done to us, it's actually our reaction.
So we always speak to the meaning we give to what happens determines then our ability to react or respond, right? Now you talked about agency and ability. Can you share how can we build that ability or agency that you spoke to? What does that look like? What does that feel like?
So it's relative. If the event is a small thing, in general, we feel like we have more tools in our toolkit. We have more resources. We have maybe more time to think about it and deal with it. But when something is novel, something is unexpected or unpredictable, and something that happens to threaten our sense of self, so our sense of security, our sense of well-being, that thing becomes more stressful. And so if we can't manage a situation, and sometimes things happen that we don't have much control over, how do we change ourselves from the inside? Do we change our view of it to make it less of an overwhelming thing? So for example, if you know that every day you have to go to work and it's stressful, well, you know that it's going to happen. So it's actually not a novel thing. It's not unpredictable. So how do I think about it in a way that makes it less stressful for me? So yes, I'm going to work. It's not a great place right now. And I know my colleagues are going to be mean to me. My boss is going to yell at me, but I know that, right? But I'm choosing to go to work because for other benefits. And therefore I feel like I'm part of the situation. I have some role to play in it. And I take responsibility for this feeling I call stress. So I think that can be helpful if we can start to shift the narrative into, well, I can manage some things, even though it's an internal thing.
Okay, so it's the narrative of what is being defined as that experience coming in. But again, you're still saying my boss is mean, my staff. So that's again, the meaning you're giving to their behavior is determining the narrative, right? Now that's a thought process. Now that's conscious.
Correct.
What about
Correct.
on the subconscious level? So if those are routine, right? That you said those are routine events that continue to happen. We can shift the meaning by changing, like you said, the basic perception of those experiences. Now let's go to something more deeper, which is unexpected, right? So how do we build what we call, you understand functional medicine, that's your base as well, and integrative medicine, where the idea is to build resilience in that space. So let's talk about the mental emotional space, right, that you're speaking to, which also relates to the relational space. So how do you build resilience for the unexpected from what you just shared? Like, how do you take the notch one step higher?
Yeah, I think resilience is a word that is used a lot now, and people want their children to be resilient. They want their employees to be resilient. So there's a lot of talk around grit, right? Resilience, and how do we become tougher in essence.
Okay.
And I think part of it is what there's a term called stress inoculation.
Okay.
So it's a little bit like your jab, a booster jab for COVID. Right? You give yourself a small dose of a virus or a toxin, and your body recognizes it as threatening, but it's able to mount a response towards it. It's able to remember that, oh, there's this thing here which is not good for me, but I've got a response ready for the next time I see it. And when you see the real thing, then you are quicker and more able to come up with a response to it. And it's the same with stress. If we live in a completely stress-free bubble, we never learn how to push ourselves a little bit outside our comfort zone. We never learn to be resourceful or find skill sets that can help us manage bigger and bigger things. So resilience is something that, if you look at children, of course they have their own temperaments, but some children are just more able to put themselves in an uncomfortable situation and tolerate that. And the same goes for adults. So it's a sense of tolerating a discomfort and being okay with it, and having a means of self-soothing, a means of self-calming, a framework of understanding what's going on, and using sometimes logic to balance emotions. Because like you said, if something unexpected happens, your body's going to respond in a way that is in survival mode. You don't really have time to think about why something is happening. You just do. For example, you come across take today, there was a fire in Causeway Bay, and people who witness it, people who experience it, I mean, it's not something that you would think about. Well, when was the last time I had a similar experience to prepare me for it, right? So there are going to be always situations that we don't have a prior knowledge of. But some people don't develop post-traumatic stress disorder, and some people do. And it's fascinating to understand which people tend to have more protective factor against developing post-traumatic stress. So these people tend to feel that they have a more positive outlook. They also feel that, well, bad things only happens once. It's not that I am a victim, it's just I happen to be in a bad place. Whereas people who think more negatively, like, oh, bad things always happen to me, I have no control over it, I suffered, and there's an internal dialogue of being kind of almost like I'm a victim of this event, as opposed to I happen to be in a bad place in a bad time, and I feel sorry that a lot of people, were hurt, but can I do something to help these people, or can I do something to help myself out of it? So I think it still comes down to, even if it's unexpected, it's the narrative inside us that drives the perceived stress, the perception of stress.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you a few things. Let's have some fun.
Yeah.
So one is, you spoke about tolerance. I mean, I don't want to live a life of tolerance, right? I don't want to be tolerating things, right? I mean, life is about embracing, right? You want to live in that. So it's, again, the meaning, right? So why would I want to live a life and learn to tolerate? So what does that mean? What does tolerate mean? Because that's, to me, means just put up with, to kind of move through it and kind of get rid of it, right? Or hope it goes away. But that experience you talked about day to day, right, of going to work and having those descriptors you gave to the to the boss and to the colleagues, life of that meaning and continuously tolerating is a pretty meager existence. Is there another
Well,
way to move through that so that it's not as, maybe I'm just triggered by the word tolerance. So tell me.
so I think, yes, we all strive to be happy and optimal and well in a holistic sense. But sometimes things do happen to us, and there is a temporary period when you're trying to figure things out. So if there is a low stress tolerance, not just like tolerating life.
Yeah.
For example, I'm not able to be mindful and be aware of a physiological response of stress, right? My heart's going really fast. I feel like I'm going to have a panic attack. I feel edgy. I can't sleep. So when we feel threatened, when we go into this flight or fight mode, your limbic system or your amygdala will be lit up. And in extreme cases, it actually shuts down your prefrontal cortex. So the part of the brain that helps us make logical decisions shut down, because it tends to take a little bit more time to work out, what I should do and not do. And if it's a life or death event, you may not have that split second. So we tend to, when in extreme intense emotions, act in a way that doesn't seem quite logical. So say things or hurt people, or throw things across the room when you're angry.
That still happens, Vanessa? People still do that? Okay.
So if you're able to just take a step back and just tolerate that sensation, you will have a better way of managing it, because you're bringing your logical side of the mind back online. You're not just reacting to something, you're actually being more cerebral about it. But at the same time, you need to be able to feel that you will feel that discomfort. So I think that's what I want to sort of explain about tolerating stress. But of course, if the situation is not conducive to happiness, you're in a job or relationship or a place that is not bringing you joy on a daily basis, that kind of stress can become chronic. It'll start to wear you down. And chronic stress is not what our bodies are built for. We're built for acute stuff, running away from the saber-toothed tiger or fighting someone. But we're not built for this day in, day out marathon of stressors. And unfortunately, society nowadays isn't about finding food or finding a warm place to sleep. It's about managing mortgages and jobs and relationships and sort of more, in terms of human evolution, more advanced things. But they also sometimes are things that don't have an immediate result or immediate solution. And when your body doesn't feel that there is a feedback, it keeps trying to make you feel more stressed, because it thinks, well, we need to find an answer. We can't just sort of leave this alone. So we'll make him or her not sleep. We'll make him or her feel anxious. We'll pump more adrenaline into the system. We'll get more stress hormone going so that he or she will figure something out. So the body is actually trying to help us when we feel this stress. It's not working against us. But in the long term, if you don't get a feedback to it, the body doesn't think it's resolved an issue, and it will just keep pushing until physiologically you can no longer sustain this level of stress hormones and adrenaline. So I think chronic stress is what people talk about in our day-to-day life that feels uncomfortable and also causes physiological, emotional, mental disruptions.
Okay, so now I'm understanding. So your definition of tolerance sounds like the space between the event and the response. So when there's a space, which you're calling tolerance, you're able to respond rather than react. When there isn't that capacity to tolerate, you react, which then, again, like you said, is a vicious cycle. Is that, am I hearing correctly?
Yes,
okay.
Correct,
It's
yes.
just, okay, it's just words, sorry, I want to clarify. Okay, so now we have this situation happening. It could be continuous. So what are the tools to de-stress? How do we de-stress our body, right? So the stressors are coming in, depending on the meaning we give, right? We can call it good, bad, whatever, mean, whatever the words are. But how do we de-stress the body? What are the mechanisms that you are teaching, or the tools to the people you care for in terms of learning to de-stress the body?
So I think with de-stressing, it could be, broadly speaking, put in two categories: things that are sort of general maintenance, and
Okay.
things that are more specific to a situation or to what you're dealing with. So general maintenance, it's a little bit like brushing your teeth. So you don't just go to the dentist once or twice a year and expect things to be okay if you don't brush your teeth the whole year, right? But when you ask people, why do you brush your teeth? It's just a habit, right? Ultimately, they understand that if they don't brush their teeth most days, there will be big problems when you go to the dentist. But if you skip one or two, it's not going to show up with immediate results. If you don't brush your teeth once, you skipped Monday, you're not going to have a dental cavity by Tuesday most of the time. Yeah. So a lot of the times we don't think about mental health as something you need to do on a daily basis. Mental well-being is actually taking care of your brain, just like you would take care of any other part of your body or any other organs. So when we're doing things during the day, we create a lot of oxidative stress. We create kind of rubbish that we need to clean out. So the only time that your brain gets to clean up this rubbish is when you're sleeping. And there's a system called the glymphatic system, as opposed to the lymphatic system, that helps to flush out all these toxins. So sleep deprivation is actually a kind of risk factor for not coping with stress, because your brain isn't able to recover well from it. So then there's also the sleep hygiene around what's helpful for good sleep and how much time you need to sleep and so on. And then on a daily basis, if you feel like your stress bubble is going to burst, you need a valve on the side to be able to release things little by little. Okay. So obviously, with COVID, a lot of people may feel that, we don't have the mobility to go travel and lie on a beach and be in a spa somewhere on an island. And those are, sort of big ticket items when we can decompress for a week or two, right? And just do something very relaxing. But even if we're not able to do that, we need to find ways of managing the stress on a daily basis. So taking 5 minutes out during lunch to sit in the park and just watch people or watch the birds and listen to noises around you, or doing a yoga session or a meditation app, or something that is more mindful, putting yourself into flow. So some people like color books or knitting or playing a music instrument, anything that helps you be more present and enjoy that feeling of what you're doing is always helpful. It puts your body immediately into a more parasympathetic state, which means you're able to rest and digest and repair your body better.
Okay, so that helps build that muscle that you're speaking to in terms of that mental muscle, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so these are not just release mechanisms, but it's actually building the muscle, or it's both?
I think it's both. I think a lot of people feel the immediate benefit of a yoga class, and it feels very relaxing after they do it. But it's also a daily practice that helps you build the strength to deal with the more unexpected things. So with a lot of people who come to me, they may have these practices in their daily life, and they do it and they feel well. But then when things starts to get difficult, they start to lose some of these coping mechanisms, because it just feels like there is no time to do it. I don't have time to go for a yoga class. I need to do something else. So then it becomes a double whammy, that you're forcing yourself to deal with a stressful situation, but at the same time not having the coping mechanisms you normally use to help balance it out. So it's
how do you make it non-negotiable, Vanessa? You got to make it non-negotiable, right? So how do you make these small little things that are paramount, right, to the mental health of the people that come to you? How do you move and shift them to non-negotiable and daily habits like brushing your teeth?
So if you aren't able to find an hour to do a yoga class because it means travel time and everything else, then shorten it into more manageable bite sizes. Do 5 minutes of stretching at home, or just go out for a little walk, or pet a dog, or listen to some music. So if you're able to fit it into smaller gaps, it feels like less of an effort because you don't have to carve out a chunk of your time. And I often tell patients, how much time do you spend waiting for the elevator, waiting for the kettle to boil, waiting for the microwave to heat your food, waiting at the petrol station when it's being filled? And so if you can use those few minutes just to relax rather than pick up your phone and scroll through social media or check emails, those are the moments where it doesn't need to take too much effort to be able to find little pockets of space.
Okay, that's amazing. So now we had Dale that was on the webinar a few weeks ago, and we were talking about dementia, right? And in there, of course, sleep health was paramount, right? Also was gut health, right? So in terms of the gut brain, I mean, we have Dr. Golay on our team as well that talks about the gut brain relationship, and so what is your perspective on that, on gut health as an impact to mental health?
So gut health is something that a lot of people are starting to understand is integral to our nervous system and our mental well-being. When people say, oh, I have butterflies in my stomach, or there's something stressful coming out, and I'll get some stomach upset or diarrhea and all sorts of things, it's because a lot of our nervous system is in our gut. So when a fetus is developing in the mother's womb, the mass of nerve cells ends up one going into making the brain and the other going to make the nervous system, the enteric nervous system. And it's connected by this highway, which is the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is primarily an afferent nerve. So it's there to sort of detect what's going on in your body. And it's occasionally sends signal down to the body to modulate the response. So when your heart rate goes up, when your breathing quickens, when your stomach goes into a knot, that's the vagus nerve reacting to stress. And there are studies showing that when, for example, someone has a head trauma, usually it's a mice study because you can't physically induce head trauma to someone ethically. Within 30 minutes, the gut bacteria, the gut flora starts to shift. And likewise, I have seen with patients where they've had food poisoning or they've had a round of antibiotics, and it suddenly starts precipitating things like panic attacks. And so it's a bidirectional relationship with stress. And it's a very visceral feeling. So when we feel sad, we feel heartbroken. Well, that's actually a physiological response in your heart that is responding to a meaning or a thought in your brain. And so it's a more tangible way, or it's a more somatic way for us to experience stress. And I think taking care of your gut obviously will be sending much better signals to your brain that everything's well, and it's less inflammatory, it's more healing, you have more nutrition going on. Most of the serotonin that's in our body is also in our gut, which is why when you take an antidepressant, which is a serotonin antidepressant, a lot of people feel there are gastrointestinal side effects because most of the serotonin is in our gut, and that's where it responds first. But in our brain, there's a separate system of where the serotonin is made. But from a nutritional point of view, if you're not able to support the body to make serotonin, well, it's not going to make it in the gut, and it's not going to make it in the brain either. So even though sometimes when we do testing and we can only test what's going on in our body, it gives you some idea what's happening overall. Well, if this person is nutritionally depleted, they are not able to have a circadian rhythm, right? That helps them make the correct neurotransmitters at the right time. Then, you would look at balancing that as well. So that's another way to support our body to become stronger in order to deal with stress.
So you talked about nutrition. That was another element. So how, we'll go back. Hong Kong, as you see, if you look at most of the time taken off by, Hong Kongers, at least in the last 10 years, it's been IBS, right? And it's all related to what you're speaking about. And it's not COVID. This is way, way before COVID that it's been going on. So from a nutritional perspective, what are you able to share with the patients, and how much are they willing to listen to shift their habits? Like what are you sharing, and what's been the success or challenge?
I think when people start to understand what their body is made of, it's essentially water, air, and the food you eat. And there are studies also showing that when you're nutritionally more replete, your medication is going to work better. So if you were ever to contemplate medications, why would you take something if your body isn't able to use it properly? So that's one aspect of how I try and get someone to think about medications and nutrition. And the other thing is, well, if you're not able to be nutritionally replete and you're not supporting your body, it's like a car. If you're giving it bad fuel, if you're not maintaining it and you're driving it in a way that is not helpful, for example, having your handbrakes on whilst you're stepping on the gas, your body's not going to work for you. And so another way to encourage them to think about nutrition is whatever you put inside your mouth and the state your body is in when you receive the food ultimately determines how well you're going to use those nutrition to support your body.
Okay, so you're bringing in also the meaning they give to the food they're eating, their state of being as they're ingesting or digesting their food as part of the process, and the absorption and the nutrients in that food. So you're bringing that psychology into it, and they are able to digest that and they're able to understand it.
Yeah, I think digest is a good word in many ways. Because a lot of the times when we're rushed, you see people, gnawing on a sandwich as they're running to catch a bus, or they're eating at their desk with the screen on, watching the stock market or checking emails. They're not mindfully eating. And the studies show that when we're not in a parasympathetic state, you can have the same person eat the same food, but it turns on and off different genes. So the epigenetic changes around food and the state that it is received in can vary a lot depending on where you are in that moment in time. So there is some, I think, truth and some ancient wisdom to people who have a religion where they say grace or the equivalent of before food, because it gives you a moment to calm yourself down, to be grateful and be together, right? You hold hands or you join in a ceremony that collectively puts everybody in a more happy, restful state for the food to be consumed and received.
So, okay, coming back to the stressors and what you're seeing, what have you seen in the last 2 years? I don't want to focus on COVID, but what have you seen the acceleration of or the deceleration of, right? Because at one hand, we've had more time with family, right? Because many people have been working from home. Hong Kong, we're a little exceptional. We haven't had a lockdown, but most countries have had lockdowns, work from home, and schools shut. We had schools shut here in Hong Kong as well. What were the benefits you saw from a mental well-being perspective, and what were the challenges that you're seeing that have accelerated and made lives a little more challenging?
Also, starting with the positives, like you said, some people find that being able to have more flexible working hours is good. So as long as they manage the work at home, they can take time out to be with their family or do more sports, and sort of manage and balance this work-life experience a bit better. So I understand it's not for everybody who was able to do it, but for those who feel that it's been a positive thing, I've really seen improvements in their mental well-being. And a lot more people have taken to the outdoors, because in Hong Kong, the places we live in are generally quite small. So being cooped up all day isn't that fun. And you realize there's a routine to going to work and you can leave the home. And now when you're stuck there, you're trying to find other places. And we're very lucky in the sense that there has been no true lockdown. And people have taken to the countryside. I mean, when Decathlon first opened here, everything was stripped from the shelves because everybody was buying camping kits, and hiking poles, and tennis rackets, and all sorts of other, sporting equipment. So in that way, I think COVID has forced us to shift predominantly a culture here, which is very work-based and long hours based. Yeah, but I think a lot of people would say that COVID has also brought a lot of stressful situations and new stresses that we collectively as a human species haven't had to deal with. Of course, technology has been helpful in facilitating having that connection, but it still doesn't make up for physical touch. When we actually touch someone, there are hormonal changes in us, and not having the opportunity to have a lot of that. For example, if you live alone or your family's not in Hong Kong with you, it's been very, very difficult. And there are studies showing that when people are more isolated, it actually shifts their immune system. So in our immune system, there's Th1 and Th2, so different arms of the immune system. Some that are more innate, so it deals with more sort of the general stuff, and there are more specific sides of the immune system. And your immune system understands that when you're isolated, you may be dealing with a different set of bacteria versus virus, and it will shift the immune system that way. So it's actually been not helpful to be socially isolated when there is a pandemic going on, because collectively our immune system isn't as good at dealing with it.
So it's counterproductive in that, from that perspective. We've actually lost the collective power and had to resource individually, but even then you're weakening.
Well, yeah, I think that's one study. So it's hard to extrapolate it to across general populations. But when we feel isolated, we're generally not in a happy place, because humans are more. We tend to live in societies. We have tribes, and when we don't have that, the body senses that as a form of threat. Well, why do we not have it? What's shifted in my environment? Something must be wrong. Why am I not getting the normal feedback of social connectivity? So that sense of, again, threat or stress will cause your immune system to change as well.
Okay, so let's now shift gears to a little stronger word, right? Which again has been used and at times abused, right? Trauma. Like how do you define trauma? And what does it mean? Because people are using it left, right, and center, right? And some with validity and some I don't, in very loosely. So can you define what it means from a medical perspective or a psychological perspective? And then what do you see, the different forms? Like what are you seeing as things are coming to your cabinet or doctor's office?
So with trauma from a medical point of view, there's sort of a one-off trauma. So one bad event happened, and it usually is something bad enough to shock your system into a state of flight or fright, right? Or there is more complex trauma. So a similar event happening repetitively, or multiple events happening to the same person and causing a more complicated or more sustained duration of trauma. But I think the word trauma, when we think about it, if you think about physical trauma, you would come up with images of road traffic accidents or blood and broken body parts. And so the physical trauma tends to be something quite impactful in a bad way to the body. But mental trauma, we can't see it a lot of the times. And if you look at the term post-traumatic stress, well, first you have to define the stressor. What's the trauma that's causing this mental disorder? So, for example, people who went through the experience of 9/11, some of them may get PTSD, and that we can understand. But actually, people who watch the event from a TV, even though they haven't physically experienced it or they're in the vicinity of it, can also still suffer from PTSD. So again, it comes back to what do you perceive as something that is a shock to your system, something that is a threat, or potentially we can empathize that if I was in that situation, it would be stressful for me too. And how we perceive our ability to cope with it. So stress and trauma, like you said, they are similar, but trauma is a stronger word.
So how do you trace it? I mean, how do you trace when somebody actually has PTSD? Like, what are the tests you're doing? Are you doing specialized MRIs? What are you doing to find out what is going on? I mean, I've had brain scans with Dr. Daniel Amen, right? And looking for the triangle which shows stress. But when I
Yeah.
asked what is causing it, they couldn't give me a timeline, right? I asked them whether it was the cancer or the divorce. They said, we don't know which one, but it's still there, even though I was doing a lot of the practices that you spoke to.
Yeah. I think that's where a good history taking session will come in trying to define a timeline of what may have caused that physiological change. Like you said, your brain lights up differently. And sometimes it's just not one thing, or it could be a series of smaller things, but it could still feel quite traumatic to a person. And the narratives you use around it, I keep coming back to it, but it's really how we see the world, how we interact with the world. And if you use the word survive, or a challenge, or I'm able to deal with it, you just feel there is a stronger sense of ability, right? So a lot of it is also going back to the cognitive aspect of how do you empower someone to deal better with stress and trauma. Is you have to start shifting the narrative a little bit. If they are kind of stuck in a victim role, it's hard for them to get out of it, because that's the narrative that helps them explain things. That's how they understand things. And it makes sense to them, even though their thoughts themselves are causing them distress. Toxic thoughts can be the cause of your physiological stress response.
So what are the physical symptoms that you're seeing from these states or these narratives or these traumas? Like what are you physiologically seeing? What are people expressing in terms of physical symptoms?
So physically, people will experience a state of hypervigilance. That meaning they are more easily aroused by small things. So someone drops something on the floor, they will startle. Things like that, when your body is in a very tense state. So every little thing seems to be more jarring and unnerving to that person, and they'll jump out of their skin. So that's one aspect of it. The other is having flashbacks or nightmares. So your body is trying to reprocess a lot of what's been going on. And when we sleep, when we have REM sleep, that's when we are trying to make sense of the world. We're trying to process emotions. We're trying to, file away things that we've learned during the day. And when something is stuck, something hasn't been processed in your sleep, your brain is trying to make sense of it. So in its own sort of jumbled version of how dreams and nightmares happen, it's trying to work it out. But because it can't, it just keeps coming up. And flashbacks are, different people would explain it differently, but my way of explaining it is your body hasn't processed it, and it keeps reminding you that something's still going on. Please handle this. Please go and deal with this. It's not over. So I think physiologically, those are the things that a lot of people would experience from a bodily sensation point of view. And the behavior around it is, well, obviously you want to avoid places that trigger, or people that trigger similar emotion. So if there was a road traffic accident, you'd avoid those streets. If you were mugged on a dark alley, you'd avoid dark alleys, because your body has learned that those places aren't safe. But the problem with avoidance is the more you avoid, the more things seem to be, you're reinforcing a behavior, right? You're reinforcing that, yes, dark alleys really are very bad. And rightly so, you've had a bad experience, right? So it's not a bad thing that the body learns, but then anything that is sort of a slightly narrow street, or, it's less crowded, or it's a long street, or one street lamp is gone, you start imagining a lot more similar situation. It starts to almost spread to other aspects of life, and you find your comfort space slowly narrowing, and your comfort zone starts to shrink, and you feel less able to put yourself out there and go out and do things again.
Okay, so some of those are some of the, so how do you help these individuals reframe those experiences, right? So when we're working, they become traumatic experiences or stressful experiences, and sometimes they turn into beliefs and patterns. So in the work we do, we help people reframe the meaning they gave to that situation in order to shift their response energetically from that moment onwards. Is that what you're helping them do? What is your process in terms of helping these individuals reframe that experience so that they can choose differently or narrate differently?
Yeah. So unfortunately for PTSD, people have tried a lot of medications, but they haven't been hugely successful, let's put it that way. Obviously, there are medications that may be helpful for certain individuals, but a lot of it is psychological work and psychotherapy. So I work closely with therapists who can do EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So how it came about was in the early 1980s. A psychologist called Francine Shapiro, she was walking down, I think it was Stanford. She was just walking down the campus, and she suddenly started to notice a lot of emotional things come up. And so when we actually walk straight, our eyes don't stay straight ahead of us. We actually dart back and forth, left and right. And she realized that this sort of saccadic, very minor movement of the eyes going left to right helps connect the reptilian brain, right, the limbic system, and then the hippocampus, and ultimately going into cerebral cortex. So it's sort of like this linear vertical alignment of the brain that helps you link together your memories versus your emotions versus your stress response around them. And so she took this to her patients, where instead of making them walk for long, lengthy sessions, she made them just follow her finger left to right. And now obviously there are devices so that the therapist doesn't have to use a finger, but using that in the security and safety of your therapist guiding you, and obviously learning the relaxation techniques that you would use when these emotions come up, you're able to connect with your thoughts and feelings in a more physiologically calm state, so that you're able to decouple that these emotions will always bring up stressful responses in the body. And so when you're able to work through a problem and you're able to talk through it, you're able to change that narrative, and you've made peace with it, your mind, your body learns that it's okay and we can now move on. Because it's always looking for things that may hurt you, right? So it's never going to stop doing that, but it doesn't. The problem is when it is stuck. So when you become unstuck, it can go on and do what it's meant to do, which is protect you and support you.
So the EDMR has been successful, from your perspective, from the people that have come in, or is it, again, depending on the trauma?
So for EMDR, it's generally a bit more useful if you have a specific event to work through.
Okay.
So some people may not have any major specific events in their lives, but they still feel very stressed. And then they use the word, I feel traumatized, or I feel helpless. So different types of therapy may work better for that. And with therapy, it's just like with any other types of treatment. It's not a guaranteed outcome. It depends on how receptive that person is, how motivated they are to continue with the treatment. So for example, I had a patient who came to me for an alcohol problem. Right, successful lawyer, works long hours, seemingly has a good family, a good career, but he had a lot of childhood issues, sexual abuse, physical abuse. And the drinking is to numb out these feelings. So now that he's got a son, watching him grow through those stages of his own childhood brings up these emotions. So it's very hard for him, because as a father, he wants to be engaged, but at the same time, teaching his son to learn to ride a bicycle brings up an event. Seeing his son go to the swimming pool to have swimming lessons brings up another event. And so he struggles between, in his mind, being a good father and being an incompetent father. And so the drinking is only a symptom. So once we were able to dig a bit further, he can recognize that these are not helpful coping mechanisms, right? Drinking. But it took me 2 years to convince him to have therapy.
Or to convince him to have therapy, not to actually
not to have therapy.
Oh wow!
So we you know, if you come to a psychiatrist, a lot of the times it is some form of, in some shape or form, medications, and he's open to, you know, monitoring his stress level, and he has an Aura ring, and he looks at his HRV. He understands that alcohol causes his HRV to plummet. So he's very logical in that sense. But there just isn't enough to shift him into accepting that he needs to deal with the problem, because it was just too overwhelming. In fact, he couldn't even meditate for a minute when we first started out, because once his mind was quiet, it goes into overdrive and all these flashbacks starts to come out. Yeah. So that's why work has been another way of coping.
Yeah, numbing, another form of numbing.
So eventually he's, you know, bit of persuasion, but doing some EMDR sessions, yes, you can still see a lot of these emotions flowing out, but his response to them is less irrational or erratic. And he's able to verbalize things a bit better. I mean, I've seen the guy for a few years, and every time he comes in, you know, big, you know, lad, you know, dressed in a suit or presentable, crumbles in tears without fail. And now he's able to at least talk through things. And yeah, every now and then he looks tearful, but it's a lot less of a physical and emotional response, because it is stressful to have to cry your heart out every time you see a therapist. You know, if it's 9 a.m., then the rest of the day is sort of a bit marred by the whole event of talking about things. And yes, by virtue of being in a doctor's office or your therapist's office, it is hard work. It's not just that we're here to hold your hand and tell you everything's going to be okay. We're here to challenge your thoughts. We're here to help shift that narrative. And it's uncomfortable to have to shift something familiar, even though you logically know that it's not helpful. So that's why I say sometimes information doesn't necessarily change behavior. Everybody knows smoking is bad nowadays, right? But people still smoke because there's a benefit to it. Alcohol is a class 1 carcinogen. People still drink. So it's also understanding the pros and cons and why you do certain behaviors, but fundamentally finding a personal meaning that makes you want to change.
Yeah,
right?
So
people can do, people can do really.
Sorry, people can do.
Well, I was just going to say, people can do really hard things if they have a meaning to it. If you believe in the mission, you have a purpose, you have a personal belief that this thing is good for you, or this is something you want, you can move mountains for it.
Yeah. So coming back to the topic, which is I think a little softer and more uplifting from where we are. Not that it's been a downward spiral, but the meaning of life. So when you deal with this individual and he sees his son, and he wants to be present, he wants to be engaged, he wants to be a loving father, right? For that meaning he has versus that all the inner trauma that's coming up, how, obviously one is still overpowering the other from what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So
you need to spring clean before that meaning is able to be in charge. Is that what was happening? And is it different from with the other experiences when you talk about meaning of life?
Well, I think the meaning of life is a very broad thing, right? And it changes even within the same person over time. What you want in life is different. So in your 20s, you want to graduate, you want to get a good job, and then ultimately you find a mate, you want a family, or you don't want a family, you want to explore other aspects of life. And there seems to be a series of kind of set goalposts for a lot of people, right? Achieve a certain level in your career, achieve a certain sort of status or social aspect of what you want in life. And a lot of the times when you see, it's the so-called midlife crisis, these people have a lot of the things they want to achieve. They've achieved things that society has endorsed them to have, to tell them that they're successful, but they may not have found an inner meaning. what they truly believe themselves to be, who they think of themselves as. Have they built anything authentic and anything that kind of helps them feel more whole as a person? It's not just taking from society. Are you giving back? Have you cherished relationships? Have you actualized something in you? And so I think that's something that is an ongoing dialogue with yourself, having a check-in with yourself every now and then, and see, well, what is it that I want from life right now? Depending on what beliefs or religious ideas, but if you don't, whether you believe in reincarnation or not, I mean, you kind of have a one-shot deal now, and nobody goes, to their deathbed thinking, oh, I wish I worked an extra day. Nobody would say, well, I wish I had struck an extra deal and made an extra million. The one non-negotiable and non-renewable source in our life is time. And I think if you look at what's, in the past 2 years, I mean, sometimes I'm still confused whether it's 2019 I did something, 2020 I did something. There hasn't been any sort of eventful thing maybe to kind of demarcate time. And you don't want to look back and think, oh, what did I do with that time? When you're young, it feels limitless. People kill time. I have teenagers who come in and spend 18 hours on their phone because they don't know what else to do with it. Wow. But when you start to, it's great to have devices these days because you can ask them to check their screen time. And I think the record so far is 18. I mean, the average was like, for that person was like 12, 14 hours, but like maxed out at 18. I'm like, do you sleep?
Wow.
So, I mean, that's a whole different conversation about how COVID and technology has changed our lives. But, being with loved ones, saying things to them, don't assume that your loved ones will be around the next day, right? Don't hold back on living the fullest version of yourself.
But do they understand that? Do they know where to begin when you say that to them? Are they willing to reflect on, what is working and what is not, or what is helping them?
Well, I think you meet them where they are, right? You meet your patients where they are and see where is the lowest hanging fruit. What's the easiest piece of the puzzle to put down? Where's the things that you can first shift? And sometimes you just need to find the right hook into that person, and things will start to unravel, things will start to shift, which is why I think for a psychiatrist particularly, but for anyone who's in a caring profession, it is also spending the time and personalizing yourself with your patient. They're not just a paper case of fractured femur or a diagnostic code of depression. They are a human being and they need to be treated as such. So for me, it's fascinating that even though 100 people come with the same diagnosis, there are 100 stories there and 100 ways of treating them. And it's been a privilege to be able to learn from people who trust me, right? People who trust doctors.
So do you feel that time, space, and possibility is expanding or contracting in terms of creating that connection and that experience so that you can really care, love, and support these individuals, right? I mean, the healthcare profession is, and in some cases very limited in terms of time because, time is precious, right? From that perspective. So you're able to, it's expanding or contracting? What are you experiencing?
I think it's expanding, but I think it's a double-edged sword. So it's easier for patients to reach out by email, by WhatsApp. They can call you, whereas in the past, you'd have to walk across town or go to the next village to see your doctor. Okay. But it's also setting the boundaries there as well, because I need to be taking care of my own mental health in order to be strong enough to help other people. Yeah. And I think learning those boundaries, not just in the doctor-patient relationship, I think it's in the workspace environment, in families, in friendships, where a lot of people are now able to not be as sensitive towards the other person. You can say things online behind a screen and not think about how it feels to the other person. So, online bullying is rampant because everybody has access to the internet, and people get away with things by being, unpleasant. So if you're not prepared to say something to someone in their face, it's best not to put it out there. And there's a momentarily, happy kind of, confirmation of like, I'm right, you're wrong. And there is a dopamine hit when people do that, when they hit send or enter, and people start to give you likes. It's little dopamine rushes. So it's reinforcing that type of behavior. So it's our biology not really catching up or adapting to the modern day technologies.
Yeah. So the president next door obviously cut down gaming for 2-3 hours only on the weekends. I think the next move is going to be social media access. So do you think, even though obviously most people don't want him to be the father or the parent, but from a mental health perspective, those are, I assume, good decisions. Am I correct? To curb down the gaming and probably next the social media hours, from what you're saying, right? If somebody's spending 12 to 18 hours a day on their phone, that's a lot of screen time.
Yeah. I think a lot of studies are now showing that, screen time isn't great. It, particularly for developing brain, it doesn't train the brain to be able to project forward. Everything's immediate gratification.
Okay.
And at the same time, you hear things about digital detox and, people trying to build in a more humanistic way of using technology. So what's a documentary on Netflix called?
Thrive.
Social Dilemma.
Social
Dilemma. Yeah. And how that they have. I mean, it's a wonderful piece of psychology. If you want to hack into someone's brain, they've done a brilliant job of it. There's like every single button that can push more dopamine out, they've got it dialed in. And so it's coming around to the moral ground of, well, where does this technology stop? We are taking advantage of a very primal system in our brain that hasn't been able to adapt. So there are cultures where you take a day off, like Sabbath, and there are no devices. You don't go out, you stay in the family, you spend time together. And rightly or wrongly, it does force people to be more creative with how they spend their time. If you took your kids out and left all the phones and devices at home and made them be creative, and kids are generally pretty good at entertaining themselves. They can take a stick and poke things around. They can climb trees. They can roll around and get hurt. And but it's giving them that space to be able to do it. Right, the iPhone is the greatest nanny of all times. But if you default to that, and I understand it's sometimes difficult to not, because there are situations where you just can't let your kids run loose. But it's good to be mindful of setting those boundaries as well. I think as parents, it's a very difficult challenge.
I've never heard anybody say that the iPhone is the greatest nanny of all times. That's interesting. Maybe
I borrowed that. I didn't make that up.
All right, so we're actually out of time, but are there some last words or sharings or recommendations that you would like to share, that anything we didn't touch on, or a reaffirmation, whatever you feel like in the last few minutes to kind of remind us or nudge us, or whatever you feel that we didn't touch on would be really beautiful for us.
Well, I hope everybody has something that they could take away from tonight. And I would just wish that everybody have a great end of the year. And I hope 2022 will bring more happiness and joy, and being able to find a place and a way to be more grounded and be more anchored inside yourself, and be stronger, be more resilient.
All right. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you for
Thank
being with
you.
us. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. We're going to take some time off for the holidays in terms of webinars, and we're going to be doing some podcasts. So we'll keep you noted by email on what's next. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you,
Thank you.
Vanessa.
Bye.